Today I'm speaking with Tim Sledge. Tim, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Tim. I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah, we've been trying to do this for a while. I think it's been over a year. We've been trying to get our schedules aligned, so this is great to finally connect. And for anyone that doesn't know Tim Sledge, you're in for a treat. Tim Sledge is a former Southern Baptist minister, and I'm sorry if I'm diverting my eyes here, just reading a few minutes. He's a former Southern Baptist minister, speaker, and writer. He was born and raised in conservative West Texas. He felt called to ministry at the age of 16. He went to Billy Graham's alma mater, Wheaton College, which we've all heard about, and he earned his Master of Divinity and Doctor of Ministry degrees from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, also in Texas. He began writing Southern Baptist curriculum materials as a 25-year-old seminary student. He was a pastor, author, and so forth, just all kinds of stuff that you did. We'll save the rest of the bio for people to go read on Amazon and so forth, but you've done a lot of stuff in your life as a Christian, so I'm excited to hear kind of how that went. I'm sure we'll get into a lot of details as you tell your story, but besides that big picture, we obviously know you've since deconverted, but before we get into the details of the meatier part of your story, can you tell us just more about yourself now and your hobbies and quirky things about you?
Yeah, I'm married, and my wife and I love to travel. We have an RV, and so we have fun with that.
Nice.
One of my hobbies is riding a bicycle, and I live in a community with about 40 miles of trails and little ponds and lakes. So I love doing that. My other hobby is photography. So I'll sometimes strap the camera around my neck and head off on my bike. And then one thing that's tied those together, I don't know how these will show up, but I recently started doing greeting cards. I don't know if you can see that. It's kind of
Yeah, beautiful.
shiny looking there. But oh, that one goes like that. Trying to do some things that are beautiful and encouraging. And sometimes recently on Twitter, somebody who didn't like me much because of my non-belief said, why are you wasting your life on Twitter? And I said, well, so I listed some of the things I do. So, life is good and I'm enjoying my life.
Hmm.
Also, I have 5 grandkids. I should have said that first, and they're
that'll keep you
cool.
busy. Where do you sell your cards, by the way? How do people get them?
I have a website called theencouragement.store. Theencouragement.store. I didn't
Okay.
even know .store was a suffix, but it is, and so that's where you can see the cards.
Very cool. Well, I'll have the links for all that beneath our video so people can go check that out. I did want to mention too, I mentioned that you're an author, but I just want to read a few titles. I'm sure there's a lot more here than we'll get to today, but the big one, of course, is Goodbye Jesus, an evangelical preacher's journey beyond faith. And just highly encourage people, please go check this book out. I love the fact that you were able to take your journey and actually put it into a book, and obviously a lot of interviews, but put it down on paper so people could actually step by step go with you through this and understand why, what happened. A few other books, I'll just mention the titles: Four Disturbing Questions with One Simple Answer, with the subtitle Breaking the Spell of Christian Belief. Another book is called Leaving Faith, Holding On, Letting Go, Looking Back, Moving Forward, and How to Live a Meaningful Life, Focusing on Things That Matter. Again, more books than that, but I love it. I love it. You're making such a huge splash in so many of our lives with these things. So I just wanted to pass the ball to you then at this point to take us into your story. How did you grow up,
Okay,
and what was
sure.
your belief system?
Yeah, as you mentioned, I grew up in West Texas. We moved around a lot. I attended 5 different elementary schools. I don't remember how many houses we lived in, and part of that was because my dad was a binge alcoholic. Most of the time, life was really good, and he was really a great dad. He taught me how to work with tools. He taught me about selling. He was a salesman, so he'd come home at night and tell stories about how he did or did not succeed in selling whatever he was selling. One of his friends one time said, if his name was John Sledge, and one of his friends said, if they ever saw John Sledge walking up the sidewalk to ring the doorbell, they wouldn't answer it because they knew whatever he was selling, they'd buy it before he left. So I mean, he was a great guy. He was a lot of fun. He played the ukulele, harmonica, sang, but I don't know, might go 3 months, everything was great, or a month or 6 months, but he would disappear, sometimes for days. And there was a real paradox because my dad had 6 sisters. He was the youngest, youngest boy of 6 sisters. And as you can imagine, his sisters really loved him. They were all very religious. My grandmother was deeply religious. And so even though my dad had this problem with alcohol, he told me the importance of God and church and Jesus. When I was we were living in a little West Texas town called Snyder, Texas. And when I was 8 years old, my Sunday school department gave me and everybody else in that class a new Bible. And I was delighted. It was, about this thick and black as they usually were. And as I looked through it, I found in the back a chart, a plan, how to read the whole Bible through in 1 year. And I decided, I made a New Year's resolution. I said, I'm going to do that. I'm going to read the whole Bible. So off I went, Old Testament in the morning, New Testament at night. Pretty soon I was reading somebody begat somebody, and I'm 8 years old. What does begat mean? But I pressed on. And during that time, we had Vacation Bible School. Vacation Bible School, for those who don't know, it's in the summer, it's 5 days long, or sometimes they were 2 weeks long. You have a lot of fun. You play games, you do crafts, and they teach you the Bible. And on Thursday, the pastor comes in and he gives a sermon. And in this sermon, he does that thing, left or right, heaven or hell, what's going to happen to you? I was already under conviction. And I think the instability of my dad's drinking heightened that. I remember one time I walked home and my dad wasn't there, and somebody I didn't know was getting into their car. And I said, Mom, who was that? She said, oh, that was somebody so-and-so. They brought us some groceries. And I thought, oh, we needed somebody to bring us some groceries. So, I think that, and it was so confusing because it was really great. And then suddenly, without any prediction, it was awful. And that heightened my sense as a child of needing help, of needing something stable. And so that summer, actually, I think I just finished reading through the Bible. I was 9 years old. And on that Thursday, I walked the aisle. I fought it. I struggled. I was crying. Somewhere in there, I prayed to ask Jesus into my heart. And for the Christians who may watch this later, I believed I was a sinner. I confessed my sins. I prayed in faith. I asked Jesus to come into my heart and to take over my life and to be the Lord of my life. And I tried the best I could, but I wasn't trying. I was trying to let go. So let's take the word try out of there. I was letting go, letting God for the next 50 years. And I really, really meant it. When I was 16, we moved to Odessa, Texas. That's the home of the Friday Night Lights football team. That's where I went to school, Permian High. The first year they won the state championship was my senior year. I didn't play football, but I did say the prayer before most of the football games. So I'll take a little credit there. It was an exciting year, as you can imagine. It was a great school. In my junior year, I was meeting with my counselor. Everybody had a counselor. And she said, Tim, I think you should run for student body president. And I said, really? I'm really not that popular. She said, and she talked me into it. So the next thing I knew, I was making a short speech before 2,000 students. And when they counted the votes, they came on the PA system right before classes changed. And I was the winner. Interestingly, the vice president was a guy named Jay, and he was a Jewish atheist. And the secretary was a Catholic. So we had an ecumenical student body set of officers. When I walked out of class and walked into the hallway that day, my life changed. Everybody was, hey, Tim, congratulations. It's like, it was so different. It was in the fall of my junior year, and we had a revival. And each night, as they do in Baptist churches, there'd be a rousing sermon and an invitation. And in that invitation, you could give your life to Jesus, or you could recommit. That's something we did a lot, slid backwards a little bit, or you could move your membership to that local church. But there was one other decision that wasn't made very often, and that was the decision to that you made when you were sensing a call to ministry. And that's what I did that night. Again, I was very sincere. My pastor asked me to preach. It was about 2 weeks later. I preached at the Wednesday night service. And then a lady came up from our Spanish missions. She said, "We want you to preach there." Pretty soon, and then after that, I was elected student body president, and that made more people know who I was. And during my senior year, I was preaching somewhere almost every week. And I was preaching not only in Baptist churches, but I preached in a Methodist church and an Assembly of God church. And I was, again, I was completely sincere. I really believed in what I was doing. I ended up at Wheaton College, as you mentioned, in Wheaton, Illinois. While I was there, I met some great people. I'd started off at a Baptist school in Texas, and there my Old Testament textbook was written by Dr. Samuel Schultz. When I got to Wheaton, my professor was Dr. Samuel Schultz.
Hmm.
And my wife and I shared a rental house with Philip Yancey and his wife, Janet. Later, Billy Graham said that Philip Yancey was his favorite writer. Another friend of mine was Steve Bell. Steve became the associate in charge of the nationwide ministries for Willow Creek Community Church, where Bill Hybels was the pastor. So Wheaton was a place where I met some really great people who became very influential in the Christian world. When I graduated, one of the things I learned while I was there is that while Southern Baptists are evangelicals, they're not. I mean, they're different. It's kind of like Texas is in the South, but it's not quite the South. It's a little bit different. And I decided I wanted to go back to my Southern Baptist seminary. So I went back to Fort Worth, Texas, got my Master's of Divinity, as you mentioned. And while I was doing that, I was called by a church in Memphis, Tennessee, to be their minister of youth. So I lived in Memphis in the summers, and then during the school year, they would fly me back and forth. And then every other time, my wife and I would drive from Fort Worth to Memphis. And that was a great experience. But I want to land there for just a minute or two and talk about a real important element of my story. This was 2 years after Martin Luther King had been shot at the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis, Tennessee. Memphis was about half African-American, half white. After I'd been going there a while, I started playing a game. I would ask myself, I would sort of track how many minutes after I get off the flight into Memphis does it take before I see some strong evidence of the tremendous racial tension in the city. And it usually was never more than 30 minutes. The kids in my youth group remembered army tanks rolling down the streets after King was assassinated. So while I was there, I started a ministry called Dial-A-Teen. My major in my master's and doctoral programs was pastoral care. And I taught some kids, teenagers, how to talk to other teenagers about their problems. And of course, as a good Baptist evangelical, I taught them how to witness, how to lead people to Jesus. But one of our rules was we're going to help people. It's not like, well, you got to accept Jesus or we don't listen. It's like, we're here to listen. We want to be helpful if we can. And kids started calling. The newspapers, TVs, and radio stations in Memphis gave us free publicity. And every Friday and Saturday and Sunday night, we got calls. Well, telephones don't tell you what color a person is. And so African-American kids called in, and we were glad they did. I was especially glad they did. And we helped them too, and we invited them to our youth events. We had a swimming party. 2 African-American girls came. Right in the middle of the swimming party, and as far as I could tell, all the teenagers thought that was great. But in the middle of the party, I got a phone call from the father of 2 of the girls in the youth group. And he said, "I understand you've got some," and he used the inappropriate word for African Americans, "there at the pool party." And I said, "No, we don't have any of those, but there are a couple of African American girls here." He was livid. He was even more livid at the way I answered his question. And he came and got his girls and took them home. Not long after that, our pastor at the church was pretty liberal minded as far as race relations in the South. And He was always publicly and being quoted in the newspaper that he was pro good relations between blacks and whites. But somebody discovered that our daycare center did not accept African American children. The newspaper picked it up, ran a big story on Saturday about the hypocrisy of our church. Our pastor happened to be attending a retreat out in New Mexico. That Saturday, an emergency deacons meeting was called, and I, as a staff member, I was invited. Just to show you how naive I was in those days, I had some pamphlets on race relations that had been produced by our Texas Baptist Christian Life Commission, and we used them in our dial-a-team ministry. And I grabbed a handful of them to take to the deacons meeting because I thought they would be looking for, this would be a time to review what does the Bible say about race relations. But when I got there, no, they didn't want to see those pamphlets. One older man, there was a concern that the NAACP said they were coming to our church the next day. And one older man, concerned they were going to come into the worship service, muttered under his breath, "I'd like to kill one of those people," or "I'd like to kill some of those people." There were no discussions in the meeting that day about what does the Bible say about race relations and what does the Bible say about, how we're supposed to get along with people who are different. It was really disappointing. The younger deacons were better than the older ones. You could see it was cultural. The culture was changing. The old guys couldn't handle it. The new guys sort of could, some couldn't. And that was one, Tim, of many of what I would call exceptions to the rule of faith. Billy Graham was my hero. I got to sit about 10 feet away from him at Wheaton College, and I just couldn't believe it. He was the most famous man in the world in those days, and his message was very simple. Give your life to Jesus, and you will be changed. The scripture says it. If anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old has passed away. All things have become new. The Apostle Paul wrote, "It is not I who live, but Christ who lives in me." I believed that. I believed in conversion. But what was evident that day is how powerfully culture could override the supposed presence of Jesus and the Holy Spirit in your heart. I'd seen it before. I guess the first time was I was preaching revivals back in West Texas, and we had a great revival in some little town, and one teenager came forward and everybody said, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe he's a Christian. He needed it more than anybody." So that was like, hooray. I went back to that same church a year later. And what was my first question? Of course, I don't remember his name, but let's say his name was Bill. "Where's Bill?" "Who?" "Bill, Bill. Who are you talking about?" "Bill, the guy with that dramatic conversion a year ago." "Oh, he came once or twice and we never saw him again." Well, that was disheartening. I mean, yeah, I was idealistic, but I believed that when you gave your life to Jesus, changes happened. And when I wrote my book, Goodbye Jesus, I came up with a name for these: exceptions to the rule of faith. And when these exceptions would happen, here's what I would do. I would tell myself, okay, Tim, you're young, you need to get more education, more experience, and then you'll be able to figure this out. So I just tuck it away, kind of in a back spot in the back of my head. Well, it kept happening. My first church out of seminary was in New Jersey. And we were so excited. We packed up. We were leaving Fort Worth, where I've been working in my doctoral program. And the moving van was packed, and we got there to New Jersey. We're 2,000 miles from home. And the mover says, "Okay, we need a check for $2,500. And I said, "Yeah, okay, well, the church is paying for it." So I called the head of the pulpit search committee, and he called the treasurer, and the treasurer said, "No, we're not paying for the moving expenses. We didn't explicitly vote on that." Fortunately, a good deacon wrote a personal check. And what I found out was the treasurer was mentally ill. And they had made him treasurer because they thought being treasurer, well, it'd make him feel better. I spent 2 years of my ministry there dealing with a man who was basically almost terrorizing members of the church. We finally exercised the biblical guidelines to remove him from the church. And before that happened, one lady told me she was afraid he was going to kill her. And then at that same church later, a guy and his wife showed up, and we were right outside of New York City, and he had that look. He had been, well, you're too young to remember, but there was a cigarette company that had a series of ads, and they were full page ads on the back of Time magazine and Newsweek magazine and in the big newspapers. And it said, I'd rather fight than switch. And you always had a black eye because you'd rather fight than switch cigarette brands. This guy had been on one of those ads nationwide, but his life had caved in. I talked to him. I prayed with him. He gave his life to Christ. And guess what? 2 months later, he robbed a bank. And I ended up visiting my new church member in Sing Sing prison up the river. That's where that comes from. It's up the river from New York City. That's something you never forget, going into a place like that. Here we have another exception to the rule of faith. I moved on to serving in Arizona, and then I came back to Texas and really found the kind of the spot I was looking for in Houston. I led my church there to grow, quadruple in membership. We reached over 2,000 members. And during that time, I had a cousin who also had been an alcoholic, and he had been to treatment, had gotten really active in Alcoholics Anonymous, and we had become really close. I'd gone to see him at a place called the Meadows in Wickenburg, Arizona, which is one of the nation's top treatment centers. Pia Melody, one of the maybe the person who really brought into public awareness the term codependency, was there. It was a wonderful place, and my cousin kept telling me, hey, Tim, they've got a program for ministers. You can go for free. They just want ministers to see what they're doing. And I just didn't want to go. But I got to a place where I said, you know what? It was in the 80s, and all these books were coming out on adult children of alcoholics. And I decided I'll do a sermon series on it. And what better way to prepare myself than to go to this free program? So I signed up. I went to the Meadows. On Monday morning, I'm sitting there in a group of 8 people. Everybody else there is an alcoholic, a drug addict, a sex addict, or something, and I'm a Baptist preacher. And after listening to about the first 30 minutes in my head, I'm not saying this out loud, but I'm saying, I've got to get out of here. I don't belong here. But I'm not a quitter, so I stayed there. And the more I listened through the week, and we were doing like 2 meetings a day, 2 or 3 hours each meeting, very intense, I started to realize that emotionally, I was like these people. Being a child of an alcoholic had brought shame into my life. And one of the things I learned that week was the sentence, I give you back your shame. Because when you grow up with an addict in your home, you take on their shame because they're not. And I want to say, because I may forget to say this later, my dad did get better. That was really encouraging. It was not real clear cut. It wasn't black and white, but he did get better.
That's great.
But I had a life-changing experience at the Meadows, and I went back and I preached the sermon series, but with more oomph and power than I had expected. I'd been having panic attacks earlier that year, and in my first sermon, I got up and I confessed that. And I talked about what I had experienced at the Meadows. The Houston Chronicle sent their religion editor to do a story on the sermon series. People were coming anyway, but after that, it was on the front page of the lifestyle section in the Houston Chronicle. People started coming from everywhere and from other denominations, all over the city. They came. In the first week, I had made an announcement. I said, I'm going to start a support group, kind of like the one I was in at the Meadows, for anybody who grew up in a difficult family situation. I was hoping to get 6 people, because I want, and this was very much in line with my training in seminary and in counseling and groups. Well, the sign-up night, we had enough people for 6 groups. Fortunately, I had a staff member and a person training to be a counselor who helped me. We did those 6 groups. We did them again in the summer, and it just kept on. And about 5 years later, we'd done 100 groups. I'd written a book called Making Peace with Your Past to be used in those groups. And I had started speaking all over the country at major Southern Baptist meetings, talking about recovery. And Tim, I'll tell you the most remarkable thing I saw. I saw people who'd been going to church for decades, 30, 40 years, who came into these groups, and we had found a way to create a safe atmosphere. And the leader would always start and set the example and be vulnerable and tell something that wasn't easy to talk about. And every time they followed the example, I saw these people, many of whom had been Christians for decades, release emotional pain they had been carrying all of their lives. It was so powerful. And my book was translated later in South Korea, and I spent 10 days over there. And then after that, I was asked to do, I spoke in chapel at Princeton, and I didn't realize this. Princeton is a Presbyterian school. Their seminary is Presbyterian, but about half of their students were from South Korea at that time. And so I led a demonstration support group for seminary students at Princeton. They didn't speak English. Well, some of them didn't speak any English, so I had a translator. But after it started going, I didn't need to speak their language, because what was happening was so emotional. I mean, I still needed to say and have it translated, but I could see what was happening, and I recognized this is the dynamic. This is human. This is not about English speaking people. This is a human issue. Later into it, though, and I don't remember the first time this thought came into my head, but it went something like this. This works better than praying to give your life to Jesus. I mean, all those things that I kept expecting conversion to do, and there were a long list of exceptions to the rule of faith that I haven't mentioned by this time. But all those things that I expected conversion, and I need to say this, because this is, I get challenged on this on Twitter all the time. I understood about discipleship. And I think one of the reasons I majored in pastoral care is I wanted to help people. I was looking for ways to make this work. And I was big on discipleship. You got to make disciples. You can't just expect them to walk down the aisle. You got to train them. Jesus said, make disciples, teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you. I worked on that big time. But still, these groups, and they have, read scripture, pray, but that wasn't what made it work. It was the openness, the honesty. And after a few sessions, the leader would kind of sit back, because people, they're helping each other. I'd been there 10 years, and I was shocked when some leaders in my church told me, the personnel committee, Tim, we want you to leave. Why? What? I mean, the church is growing. There's no moral. I didn't do something immoral. I didn't take any money. What's going on? Well, some people aren't happy with your leadership. So it boiled down to a Wednesday night business meeting. And by that point, I'd written multiple books. I've been traveling all over I was burned out. I realize now. And I had just, by the time that meeting happened, I was at a place where, wow, if this is what it's like to work at a place and give your life and soul to it and have this much success, I don't want to be a pastor anymore. I'm still a Christian. I want to be a writer. I'm going to go around and speak about Christian recovery. So we went through the motions, and I got up and spoke for a moment. And when I finished, I got a standing ovation from 80% of the people there. And that's when I knew I was being railroaded. There wasn't a large group of people. But by then, I didn't care. I wanted to leave. So I left. That was in 1996. I did a bunch of different things. But what turned out to be the most permanent thing, I had always been interested in computers, and had taught myself how to do some simple programming. And I actually started a software business, designing software for other businesses. And I still do that today. The next stages are not as easy to describe in my story and in my life. For the next few years, right after I left the church, I did a Christian radio talk show on a station in Houston every day, Monday through Friday. I worked at our Baptist Counseling Center. But those things, the radio wasn't a way to make a living as much as I loved it. And the station today would be a station, the network it was associated with would be politically a group that I couldn't stand. And I could see that coming, not as radically as it's happened with Donald Trump on the scene, but that just didn't work. And so the counseling, that I really admire counselors. It wasn't my thing. I admire people who can listen to the problems of other people all day. I found it hard to let go of them when I went home. And so I ended up doing programming. I got involved with a company. The internet had just come about, and I sold the internet, cheap internet, dial-up, reached the top of their marketing division in the country. But it was about 5 years after I'd left the church, I was asked to go help another church in Fort Worth start a recovery ministry. And the associate pastor there was a great friend of mine. And while I was there, I met someone. She was assigned to me as an assistant. And what I really wanted at that time in my life more than anything else was emotional and spiritual health. And I was passionate about it. And this was a person who, when we met, one of the first things she told me was, she said, "Your book changed my life." And she had had a lot of struggles and a lot of problems in her life. And over a period of 4 months, we developed an emotional connection. There was nothing sexual, no inappropriate touching. I was trying to stay within the boundaries. But that led to my leaving my marriage of 34 years. And this is the first time I'd ever done anything that, any serious infraction of the rules of my faith. And I accepted the fact that once I did this, I was no longer qualified to be a minister. I deeply regret my decision, the way I did it. I have asked my ex-wife to forgive me. We're friends. We're still parents of 2 sons and 5 grandchildren. We've reconciled in that sense. I wasn't thinking clearly. And that relationship, after about 10 years, it also ended. During that time, and one of the reasons it ended, and one of the things it's important to me to say is that this was an emotional affair, and really, I think emotional connections are much more challenging to deal with, perhaps, than the typical physical affair, but no less dangerous. But we were trying to stay within the guidelines, but eventually, after I had told my wife I was leaving, it did reach a point of becoming physical and sexual after I had announced that I was leaving and after I'd left. Again, these are things that, looking back, I wish I'd have handled them differently. It's probably evident that talking about this is painful, and it is. But I think it's important to establish that because of what's next in the story. At this point in my life, I was anything but arrogant. I'd been humbled. I'd made a decision to put the awareness of who I was and my whole denomination, my national speaking opportunities. I chose to put it all behind me because I wanted to be happy. I wanted to be emotionally healthy. And I also wanted to be spiritually healthy. I didn't believe, I followed the Bible pretty conservatively and strictly. I didn't believe I was qualified to be a preacher anymore. I wasn't trying. But I did want to find a church home. And my new wife and I looked for churches. And I would go and I would have a lot of hope. And I would try to make a connection. Sometimes I would talk to the pastor and I'd say, "Look, this is who I am. I need help. I want to be restored spiritually. I think more often than not, I scared them. These were usually smaller churches, and I don't know if they wanted somebody like me that close. We visited lots of different churches. At one point, after about a year, I even went back to the church where I'd met this person that I ended up marrying. And I told him I was sorry. I asked him to forgive me. We were in a Starbucks. I thought he knew, and I both knew it was going to be a tough, kind of intense, intimate conversation. But his secretary called me and said, meet him at Starbucks. And I said, I asked him his forgiveness. I told him I was wrong. And I told him I didn't want to be a leader. I just wanted a spiritual home, a church where I could get back at a good place spiritually. And he got up in the middle of that meeting and he said, you know, some people are permanently broken, Tim, and you're one of those people. And he stormed out. It was especially confusing to me because I knew there was a guy on his staff who had an affair and nothing was ever done. It was swept under the rug. So I never could understand that. I went to another church where the pastor was a former counselor and I thought he could help me. He referred me to his counselor guy on the staff who I had to pay to go see. And he was a guy who I don't know what his training was, but he didn't seem to be present. And finally, after about 3 sessions, I got through to him to like, hey, be here, be present with me. And he told me that his wife had murdered her ex-husband. And wow, okay. So you should be able to understand that, you know, being in a place where your life isn't kind of by the book, but there was something there that was, you know, he was closed up. And I don't know if that makes any sense or not, but I just realized that he couldn't help me.
Yeah.
Finally, after visiting one more church, I just said, this is just making me feel bad. I'm not going to go to church anymore. And once I made that decision, it was like these blinders came off my brain. I started letting myself go to places. I turned off my confirmation bias tools that kept excusing all those ways church didn't really work the way it was supposed to, and how many negative, bad, hurtful things occurred in churches, and how many people in churches were hurting but not allowed to tell anybody that they weren't okay because that would embarrass the message of the gospel. And one of the first things I admitted to myself, I had several friends who had children who had come out as gay. And I'd been thinking about that issue, and I was able to say, you know what, they didn't choose to be gay. They were born who they are and how they are. I don't think being gay is a sin. And then next I was thinking about hell. And I said to myself, how could a loving God send people to suffer forever? No, I don't believe in hell anymore. Well, the next logical step was, obviously, the Bible is not without error. You can't trust the Bible. And after that, I just kind of lost track of it, but because it was like jumping on a water slide and splashing. Into the water, into the sunlight. My friend Jay, the Jewish atheist guy, the VP of the student body at Permian High School, we were still friends. And he lived also in Fort Worth, which is where I was at the time. I invited him to lunch. We sat down with our Texas barbecue plates, and I said, Jay, I don't believe in Jesus anymore. his jaw literally dropped. It took me an hour, I think, to convince him, for him to assimilate what I was saying, because he had known me since high school. I had tried to win him to Jesus. I wasn't mean or hostile, did it as a friend. He never budged. That day, I apologized to him for the arrogance of thinking that he needed to be like me because I was talking to God and God was telling me the truth.
Mm.
Jay's friendship came to mean a lot to me because at first there were so few people who could do anything other than feel revulsion or fear in what they saw happening to me. That was around 2007 or 2008. I didn't write it down. For the next 10 years, I was a quiet non-believer, a quiet atheist, because I decided not only is Jesus not true, but how could there be an all-powerful, all-knowing, loving God? Look at the world, look at the suffering, and look at all the different religions. The Christians themselves can't figure out what all the Bible says, and they're fighting about it. If there were an all-powerful, all-knowing, loving God, that God would surely be able to make himself or herself or itself known to every single person, even if they haven't been to school or they're not educated. Everybody would understand it. So no, maybe there's some creator beyond our understanding, but there is not an all-powerful, all-knowing, loving God. No, I don't believe it anymore. So I'm an atheist.
Mm.
But I was quiet about it. My friends knew, my family knew, but that was about it. About 9 years after that meeting with Jay, I was thinking about what I was doing and how I wanted to spend the last quarter of my life. And I decided I wanted to shift my focus to writing. And the first thing I wanted to do was tell my story, because I'd been single for a while. And by this point, I met someone else, my wife, Mary Lee. And we found a lot of joy and happiness. And like any other marriage, we have our struggles. But I was in a good place as far as that part of my life. And I decided to tell my story because prior to meeting Mary Lee, I'd met a lot of people when I was in the dating world, and I was meeting people in other ways too. And when I would tell people, well, I used to be a minister, but I don't go to church anymore, I don't believe in God anymore, they would always say, they said, wow, tell me what happened. They wanted to know my story. So I thought, well, okay, I'll write it down. I spent about a year working on Goodbye Jesus, and in 2018 it was published. And we have here in Houston a secular community called Houston Oasis. And on Easter Sunday, 2018, I came out to whoever wants to know that I'm an atheist, and you can read about it in my book, Goodbye Jesus. Since then, I've gotten involved with that community. I've connected with other writers who have left Christianity, and I've connected with people like yourself online. And I now know so many people who've gone through experiences like mine and leaving their faith. And I know because of that, I'm not alone. You're not alone. We're not alone. And I'm active on Twitter. Many days I ask myself why, but it can be pretty brutal at times. But one of the main reasons I'm there is so other people will know you're not alone. And another reason I'm there, I spent total time served 50 years, 35 years in ministry, 50 years total as a Christian. And sometimes I'll post something on Twitter, and I guess a well-meaning Christian will say, oh, you never were a Christian. Then I give them the short version, like, the 4-line version of, well, how about this? And how about this? And how about this? No, I think I qualify. I was a real Christian. And if you can do what I did for 50 years and still not figure out how to be a Christian, it's too hard for the regular average person. It was too hard for me. It's too hard for anybody. So no, I'm sorry. I'm not going to buy that one. But my second point is that I'm here with you. I'm writing. I'm on social media because I spent 50 years. And I don't know if I would have spent that long if we had programs like yours and all the interaction on social media about leaving faith. If we'd have had that 30 years ago, I'm not sure how it would have impacted me. But I want to be a part of correcting the message that I shared that I now believe is untrue. I'm not at war with Christians. I'm not trying to close down the churches. I would fight for freedom of belief and freedom of choice, even for those who disagree with me. But I don't think it's true. And truth matters.
I gotta just say, I feel like the word wow comes to mind. That's just an amazing story, and it's an amazing emotional journey, just all the different aspects of it. And I just want to, before I get into some questions, I just wanted to acknowledge and say thank you for the vulnerability and the emotion that you clearly are willing to share. I'm sure it goes a lot deeper in the quietness of your own heart, but just being willing to share some of that with us means a lot, because
Thank you.
I think that's one of the aspects I'm in. Just for context, I'm in connection with and even partnering with in different ways a lot of different other YouTubers who focus a lot on the things like the origins of Christianity, the mythology, the academics of it, and I love that. It's so big on my heart. Great people doing that work, and it's very necessary. But in the midst of that, I think it's so critical for us to step back and say, when you learn these different aspects of comparative mythology, or where the Bible came from, and how Christianity evolved and so forth, it's not just information. Like, it has waves of impact on you as you realize, like, that the whole dynamic of, like, oh, that changes things. Oh, that changes things a lot. And it eventually hits you both that you're, in a sense, losing I mean, yes, we say, colloquially, we're losing our faith, but I like to use the illustration of, my dad passed about a little over 4 years ago, but when he died, of course, there was and I've just correlated in my mind, because I ended up deconverting later that year, about 8 months later. But at his funeral, of course, it was like any other funeral for your father. You go and you grieve. Everyone's, "I'm so sorry for your loss. I'm so sorry. I hope you all can heal and grieve properly." Very somber, very appropriate funeral, as it should be. But when you later that year, I had a funeral of sorts for my heavenly father, who was arguably much more important. You love your own father, but you also expect your father to pass, if you outlive them, and you expect that part of life to move on from, but you expect your heavenly father to be part of your eternity forever and ever and ever. And so when that funeral comes up, it just feels like you don't even know how to process it. It's like, what do I even do with this? It's so overwhelming. I can process my physical father's death, but how do I process? And I know we're not saying that God died. We're saying he wasn't there the whole time, but just emotionally, it's like, my heavenly father died. This isn't just information about comparative mythology. I just lost the father that I thought was overseeing my life in love, guiding me, opening doors, making sure that I had a future and a hope, and an eternal destiny that was with him. And to think this was all a mirage, and
Yeah.
the deception, the realizing you've been deceived by others who've been deceived by others. You've been self-deceived. You've bought into a lie. You've been listening effectively to dead men from thousands of years ago. Just processing, how did this happen, and processing both the death of your heavenly father, but also realizing he wasn't a good character after all. Understanding the whole dynamics of the psycho Yahweh character, and you put this all together, and it's like, yeah, it's information, but this is like an emotional roller coaster. Like sometimes it's like you don't even have words for it. It's like I don't know what to do except I just feel like crying. I've lost so much time, and this has been so weird. But in the extra weird part, I'll just add, and you can make comments if you want to. But the weird part about it is when you're going to your father's funeral, everyone is respectful and saying, "So sorry for your loss." When you say, "I'm having a funeral of sorts for my heavenly father," not that we put it that way, but that's what they put the pieces together, and that's what's happening. Instead of them being respectful of your grief and of your journey, they're basically like giving you the middle finger, like, screw you, like, what the hell are you talking about? What's wrong with you? And why,
Exactly. Yeah.
they want to wound you at the most important grieving process of your life.
Yeah.
And it's overwhelming. It's really overwhelming.
Well said. So you've described a loss. Losses create grief. Grief has stages. Denial, anger, bargaining. The list, I think there are like 6 or 7 stages that were part of I think it was Elizabeth Kubler-Ross who came up with those. And so, yeah, you've made some really good points, Tim, about that process. Um, and I'm still thinking about what you just said because it's really good. So when and my father died while I was still in seminary, and when one of your parents dies, people surround you with support. But when you leave, your belief system and so much depends on which part of Christianity you're leaving, because everything's different. But my experience, a lot of shunning, not so much, oh, you're crazy, we hate you, just disappearing. And um, that can be very painful. I think one of the challenges and one of the values of this kind of informal community that exists online, on YouTube, on different forms of social media, is that we talk to each other and we have an environment where I'm sorry that happened to you. I see your grief as you talk about it, and I'm sorry for the loneliness that comes with it. I understand that too. Um, and one of the things that is kind of not really funny, interesting to me, is that I used to preach about, now, it's a total commitment. We need to be so committed to Jesus that no matter what anybody else does or says, we're committed. And people may say bad things to you. They may dislike you, or who knows, maybe in the future we'll be persecuted. I was always preaching about that. But ironically, I hardly ever was treated poorly because of as a minister in Texas, or wherever I was. Really, I was respected. But as a non-believer, the stuff that I talked about and warned Christians they might need to be ready to do, I experience just about every day. Now that's my choice because I go online but I'm real careful. I go after ideas and beliefs, not individual people. And many times I'll say, well, I don't believe this, or here's what I think is wrong with this belief. And I'll get 5 responses. You idiot, you're stupid. You never were a real Christian. You're going to burn in hell. And that burn in hell thread is like, and I'm glad you are, it's kind of the way it sounds with some people.
Mm.
And then another favorite is, you're not even capable of morality anymore. Well, bad news, folks. I sinned as a Christian. I sinned supposedly with all the resources available to any Christian. I still care about morality. I believe in accountability. I believe in honesty, openness, helping other people. And then I have people tell me online, no, that's impossible. It's kind of like a little kid on a bike with training wheels sees an older kid go by on 2 wheels and says, you can't do that. That's impossible. No, it's not. Look at him. He's riding on 2 wheels. So, yeah, but it's a tough journey. And so, I'm looking back to 2007 or 2008. I don't think a week goes by And this is because I watch a lot of YouTube videos. I follow Bart Ehrman, one of my favorite writers and scholars, and Myth Vision, and recently discovered Paulogia. Those are some of the people that I have learned a lot from. And it's like I'm getting another seminary education. And like you mentioned earlier, I'm seeing all these things like, and here's a question I ask myself every week. How on earth did I allow myself to believe those things for so long? I have part of an answer, at least. When I first went to college, I had Old Testament, and the teacher one day said, now some people are going to tell you that the God of the Old Testament is mean and cruel, and the God of the New Testament is loving, but don't listen to them because they're the same God and they're not any different. And I'm not proud of this, but I sat there and in my head said, okay. Or when you come up to another problem, some difficult problem, well, like evolution and the actual age of the earth, and somebody says, well, to God, a day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is as a day. We don't know how he did it. Okay. But then when you get into that, recently I did my 23andMe DNA test, and a little message popped up, and it said, Tim, you have more Neanderthal DNA than 80% of our customers. I'm kind of proud of that. What about the Neanderthals? Did Jesus die for them? Does the Adam and Eve story take that into consideration? No, it doesn't. So then the liberal Christians say, oh, come on, Tim. It's not literal. But the Apostle Paul said, for as by sin entered the world through one man, so salvation came through one man, Jesus. So you got a bit of a theological problem there. If Adam is metaphorical, then is Jesus also metaphorical? The message doesn't hold together. It's full. And, even with all the training I had in theology, there were so many things and so many passages that I'd read some expert's explanation, but if I wasn't careful, and 6 months passed, I'd already forgotten it. And the reason I'd forgotten it is because it was circuitous. It was mental gymnastics. So it wasn't easy to remember. One of the things I've noticed about the community of non-believers is that I'll think of something like, it's kind of a concept, and then I read somebody like you, I hear you say it, or I read somebody else say it, and somebody else, it's like we're thinking the same things because they're basic and simple and true. So that's a real different feeling.
Just a quick question of something you said brought this question to mind. This is probably one of the faster questions to answer, but did it surprise you as you were deconverting and then even just in deconstructing earlier? Did it surprise you at all that you went through so much intense training and never heard some of the most basic things about ancient history, about even stuff like early church history? And I'm referring to things like, an example in my life. I literally went through my entire childhood, and I mean, my childhood, I know this, I didn't share my story with you yet, but my childhood was intensely focused on, even as a young child, preparing to be a pastor. Not that my church or parents were pushing for that. I was pushing myself. I was seeing missionaries and pastors and feeling compelled to be them as a young, I remember as an 8, 9-year-old reading, Puritan pastors, big, the old books, the great old books from the Puritans, Spurgeon, as an 8, 9, 10-year-old thinking, I want to be a pastor. I want to be preparing my heart and mind now to be a pastor. So, I was listening to them in a sense through books, and I was listening to Christian radio, constantly listening to John MacArthur, Chuck Swindoll, Alistair Begg, a lot of the old time, Oliver B. Green, older, preachers that are long gone. A lot of that just constantly in my head, memorized thousands of verses. went to a Christian school for part of my time, and was at church all the time, youth group all the time, went to Bible college, Bob Jones and Lancaster Bible College, then went to New Tribes Mission to be a Bible translator. And throughout that entire time, if someone had said, "Have you ever heard of the Epic of Gilgamesh?" I would have said, "I've never heard of that." My entire training in life, I'd never heard one single time the phrase
Mhm.
Epic of Gilgamesh. That's just obviously one example of thousands we could give. But did it surprise you at all? Just just what was withheld, and maybe a corollary, do you think that some of them knew and didn't tell you, or do you think it's just blanket ignorance?
Well, the answer is yes, it does surprise me. And some of the things I did hear, but it was always in the context of, and here's why that doesn't matter, or here's why that's not the way it sounds.
Mm,
Just like the Old Testament professor who said, well, the Old and New Testament gods are really the same. Now, I have to be faulted for a lack of critical thinking at that point, but so back up a bit, go back to my childhood experiences in churches in West Texas and on all the way through. You're being told doubt. It's like a marathon runner is going to have pain. He's got to learn to deal with that pain and not let the pain stop him from finishing the race. So doubt in this world that I was in, and I'm guessing you too, doubt it's the enemy. Don't let doubts kill your faith. Don't give up. Don't listen to the doubts. Keep running the race. And so, and that's imprinted at a really early age. So and it sounds like how cults work. You're being told, don't ever doubt this. It's the worst thing you could do. And another message is the worst thing you could ever do is leave. God is good. Satan is evil. We're fighting the battle. We're trying to make the world the way God wants it to be. We're trying to help people. And so you get all that in your head. And then if you're as a minister, the more of your life is called the sunk cost fallacy. So I have a degree in Bible from Wheaton College, Bachelor of Arts in Bible. I have a master's degree from seminary, a doctorate from seminary. I've been working, and at each point, by that time, so when you're writing sermons, you're at least in the world I lived in, the people, they don't want to hear a sermon on why the Bible might not be true. They want a sermon that's going to encourage them and make them stronger in their faith and help them get through the week. And so that's what you're focusing on. But I can't justify not seeing it sooner. I don't feel good about that. But the answer is yes. It surprises me how many things I didn't see, but maybe more how I saw them, but immediately was given or found a reason to say that doesn't really matter. And then I shared that with others. So I became part of the system, part of the program. I never had a sense, well, I'm going out there and deceiving those people. Never. I would have quit the next day if I didn't believe it.
on the receiving end, not where you were ministering, but where you were just being given training and preparation for ministry, does it surprise you looking back that people didn't actually bring these issues to your attention more, in the sense of saying, not necessarily that we as Christians can't explain them away, but just that you need to be aware of them. You need to be aware, for example, of Asherah and her story with Elyon and so forth. And just, do you think that they were, most people were deliberately like aware of it but keeping it from you, or do you think most people are just completely ignorant in the church about true history?
Well, I think when I hear your question, I think mainly about my professors at Wheaton and at seminary. Wheaton was actually quite rigorous in some ways. We studied liberal theologians like Emil Brunner and Karl Barth, but it was with the intent of why they weren't quite right. I mentioned Bart Ehrman earlier. He went to Wheaton College a few years after I did, and I actually had the same Greek professor that he did, because and I haven't met Bart Ehrman, but he's written about who his Greek professor was. And I met somebody else from Wheaton recently online, and we were talking about Bart Ehrman, and Bart Ehrman went to Princeton Theological Seminary, which was known to be very liberal. Nobody I knew at Wheaton was going to Princeton. You just wouldn't do that. And this person I met gave me an insight. He said that this Greek teacher that Ehrman had, and who was also my Greek teacher, behind the scenes was a lot more liberal than students knew, in the classroom. And that was possibly part of what influenced Ehrman to go a different direction. If that's true, and I haven't verified it, but it kind of makes sense, that would say here you had a professor who, yes, knew things he wasn't telling. Why wasn't he? Well, he didn't want to be fired. I don't know that justifies it. But and I've had some other indications that there may have been other professors there who were that way as well. But I think if you go through in ministerial training, if you go through a conservative path, it's probably more either your professors don't know it because they've turned the other way and not looked. If they know it and don't tell you, they're pushing it down. It's a form. We're under this magic spell, But I think for ministers who go through a liberal theological training, I think, and this has been brought up, I think people from the Clergy Project have mentioned this. A lot of these ministers do know things, and they're not telling them, maybe not because they would get fired, but just because people are trying to get through their lives, and they're coming to church because this is their hope. So if they come to church and you're telling them, this isn't all it's cooked up to be, they're not going to come. And so I don't know, it's like a vicious circle or whirlpool or something you get sucked into. But I'm not trying to justify any of it. I feel I'm not happy about the fact I stayed so long and I ignored things so long. And I am learning things that I saw them, but I didn't see them. And they're amazing. It's amazing how many deep, serious problems there are in the Bible about how it fits together, how it doesn't make sense. You can look at the resurrection, well, this person, named people saw it, and there were 500 people who saw it, Paul writes. Well, who were they? Did you get one of the names? No. Well, that's a little suspicious. But when you're a preacher, you say 500 people saw the resurrected Jesus. End of story right there.
A corollary question I had to what we're talking about. You mentioned that at the beginning of your starting to share your journey with people, that you did have people that said to you, "Oh, that's really interesting. Why did you leave?" My experience, and a lot of people that I've talked to, it's been a little bit different in that either maybe it was a couple outcomes, but two big ones. Number one, they say, I don't really care to know. Or number two, they'll kind of like, they're a little bit curious, but then when you give them information, they never go and research it. They don't really want to, to dig in. I could give some examples, but I think you know what I'm talking about. But the stuff we're talking about, even with Bart Ehrman and his books, if you say to people, I left, and they're like, well, you knew the gospel, you knew it was at stake, Pascal's wager and all that, eternity is at stake, and that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. I mean, to who else shall we go? You had everything, and you had literally, to borrow from Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, you had a golden ticket to heaven. You were you were right there. You had everything you needed for life and for eternity, and you walked away. What in the world would cause you to do that? You would think that people would really want to know, like you mentioned earlier, but most people that I've talked to, they don't care. I mean, even closest loved ones, my own wife, my mother, siblings, friends, Christian friends, they don't care. They don't ask. And just like, how much have people dug into your reasons? And do you get the sense that they really want to hear it, or more just that they want a quick, 2-minute answer that they can quickly look up the apologist's best response to and kind of reconvert you?
I think it all depends on the context in which we're meeting the people involved. And what I've found writing and being online, and increasing the number of people who hear my story, I have found people who are curious and who are interested. I think that you almost have to have something happen that jars you, that makes you start listening. And if that something hasn't happened, you don't want to listen. You don't want your bubble burst. You don't want one more thing that's not as good as you thought it was, because life throws a lot of those things at us. And I think this is a good point. I want to be sure I clarified one thing in my story. Why did I leave? So, well, I'd been seeing all these exceptions to the rule for years and decades. And I started doing groups, and I found something that seemed to change people in a more powerful way than the spiritual tools. And then I got broken. I got to a place where I needed a healing place for hurting people, which was what we called the last church I led. And I couldn't find it. But some people say, oh, you left because your feelings were hurt. No. The church got rid of me in 96. It was another 10 years before I left my faith. What happened was I came to a place of brokenness that forced me to look at things I wasn't willing to look at before. And in that place of brokenness, these mental shackles fell off. And it was when I looked at the issues, I said, this isn't true. I can't believe this anymore. So ultimately, it was about the content of faith. It was about the effectiveness of faith, and watching it in all these different places not work as promised. And yes, I was hurt, but I'd been hurt many times in my life. The brokenness led to a place of, if somebody said, I left my faith, I would have then said, tell me about that. Whereas before, I would have listened in a perfunctory way, looking for an opportunity to introduce them to Jesus or help them get back to Jesus. So I think the key, and it's something we don't really have any control over, is what else has happened in a person's life that's brought them to a place of openness that maybe they've never experienced before. And I'm interested in what you think about that, Tim. That's just, I don't know. That's just my theory.
Yeah. One of the things that comes to mind as you're speaking is another person I've interviewed a couple of times, a great guy. You may have heard of him, Jonathan M.S. Pierce. He's in the UK. He has a blog and a YouTube page called A Tippling Philosopher. But we've talked a few times, and he talks about the idea that what we're doing when we tell people we've left, we've, in my words, escaped. I like to say I escaped the Bible prison. But when you say that to people, you're not just telling your story. You are telling your story, and it's your story, but you're doing something more. And the extra step you're doing is behind the scenes of the implication. And my friend Jonathan Pierce talks about how there is a terror dynamic that's implied. In other words, if I tell my story and it's got an implication that what I'm saying is actually accurate, that Yahweh is not real, Jesus isn't real, then Christianity is not real. Therefore, you, Mr. Christian, Mrs. Christian, you have actually, number one, you've got no hope for the afterlife. That's destroyed. You've wasted years, if not decades, of your life, as you and I have both done. I mean, certainly there's good things that we could look back on it through that, but in some ways we've wasted a lot of time that we would like to get back if we could have. And in terms of like just your daily worldview, your life, even the Apostle Paul says, if Christ isn't risen, you're of all people to be most pitied. So it's like you literally are just wasting your life away in mythology. And the implication of all that, of maybe even to the blessings of heaven and seeing your loved ones that have already passed, the terrorizing feeling of if there's even a shred of truth to what caused you to deconvert, if that's true, then my life is kind of shattered. And instead of my addressing your claims of there's issues in the Bible, maybe it's not true, maybe Yahweh's an evil character, instead of addressing it, it just becomes a fight or flight issue where I have to shut down, I have to put up the walls, not because they're necessarily trying in every sense to be intellectually dishonest, although I think a lot of them are, but it's just too painful to face the facts that this, if what we're saying is true, then you are of all people to be most pitied and you are wasting your life. And there is no second life to come after you die. And I think people just get to a point where they're like, I just can't. And of course, the immediate context too, I should add of, if I do this, my conservative fundamentalist Christian parents are going to disown me or hate what I'm standing for now. My friends are going to say, what's wrong with you? All the stuff you've talked about in your story, they're just going to respond in such horrific ways. I'm going to become a shell of myself. I mean, my life is basically going to crumble. I mean, yes, if you've got a little scope for the imagination, you can imagine rebuilding it. But if you don't know atheists and you don't have a community built, your world is just about to crumble in on itself in horrific ways that you're just not prepared for. And so it just seems like it's easier for them to say, this is terrorizing, I can't deal with it. And therefore they won't, they don't, and they won't. And it it breaks my heart. I understand it, but it breaks my heart. I think the one thing I'll just add, and feel free to touch base on this, is I feel like the thing that's surprising to me is how few of them actually tried to win me back. Like, you think, okay, if you really believe in this stuff, number one, that it's this glorious message of redemption. Number two, that there's a fearful fate waiting for me in the afterlife if I don't believe. And I know some Christians don't go that route, but a lot of them, for my circles, they do. You're about to burn in hell. Um, if you really believe there's that much at stake, don't you want to at least try? And I mean, my Christian wife, my Christian mother, my missionary brother, works for JARS, or doing Bible translation stuff. All these people that know the Lord, so to speak, or they're in missions and ministry, they didn't reach out one single time. I mean, not once, and say, "Can we have a chat? Can we talk about this?" I got one little quick letter from my father-in-law, maybe a year and a half after my deconversion. It wasn't a phone call; it was just a quick letter. Jesus, died for you. I hope you'll return to him. That kind of thing. But nothing like, you clearly have serious objections. Let's talk through them because I care about not just your questions,
Yeah.
answers, but I care about your spirit and your soul.
You know,
Nobody.
I think if we think about when a Christian knows somebody who leaves and they're considering talking to them, what are the things that would make them feel that they can do that successfully? Well, one would be if the person who left obviously was half-heartedly committed to Christianity, because then they could say, well, it didn't work because you didn't really put that much into it. You weren't sincere, you didn't have enough faith. And in addition to that, they would need to be able to feel that they know at least as much about faith and the Bible and the teachings of Christianity as that person who left. And if they don't have either one of those things, and what you've shared about yourself, there probably are very few people who could check either of those boxes with you. And what that boils down to is it's intimidating. And because of your reading and your level of commitment, your awareness of the issues of faith, what if they start doing that and the next thing they know, you're convincing them? And this gets to, I think, a core underlying issue about leaving faith. And it is simply that it takes a lot of courage. And so anybody who's left, and never believers, lifetime atheists don't always understand this. But it takes a lot of courage. And, the whole idea of being sheep, followers, most people are followers. And here in the United States, the river is flowing in the direction of faith and Christianity. So you're saying, okay, get out of the river, swim the opposite direction. It's like the things that we pretend you have to face in America being a Christian, where you're going to have to be willing to be, disregarded and disliked. Well, I don't know, but for sure, if you leave your faith, those things really are going to happen. And maybe the best option on the list is just being shunned. Just, I'm not seeing you anymore. Or if we do see each other, I'm not going to bring up the elephant in the room, which is, I think you're going to hell. So I don't have an easy answer for that. In our support groups, I learned this at the Meadows. I support you, Tim. I support you. That just means I'm with you. I get it. And I sometimes think, well, what if I could take a magic pill and get this belief back? Would I? And the answer is no. And the reason is simple. Truth matters. How do you waste your life? Spend the whole thing never being open to the truth, never being willing to change. I look back at my life and I don't know, maybe I should be able to do this better, but I can think of, the funerals that I led, the people in the hospital I visited, the things I said about encouragement and encouraging people to be the best they can be. I like to think I did some things that were good without regard to faith or lack of faith. But I also have to say that, I spent a lot of time saying and doing things that aren't true. I can't change that. What I can do is what we're doing right now. I can write, I can talk. I see myself as kind of like the person who went real far down the road and the bridge is out, the river is raging, and I come back and I park my car and I turn on the emergency blinking lights and I'm waving my hands. And when somebody comes up, if they'll stop, I'll say, the bridge is out. Don't go down there because, you could end up in the river. But it's up to other people if they want to listen to me. And I don't bring, when I meet somebody new, I almost never bring up the subject of non-belief. If they bring it up or if they ask a question, I'll tell the truth. But it's a delicate issue, and especially in business. And I understand, and even in my business, I don't talk to my clients about it. I mean, if they ask me, I would tell them. But it's, and I prefer the term humanist because that's being for something. I don't want to be just against something. Atheist, agnostic, without. So I like being for equality, loving other people, doing things for other people, being kind to other people, disregarding differences, making the world a better place. Those things matter a lot to me still. And so,
Amen.
yeah, amen.
I just wanted to say too, I consider the issue of regret. I didn't get as far in some ways toward my ministry aspirations as I'd hoped to, but I was on fire, as they say, as a Christian teenager. I was doing soup kitchen preaching. I grew up around Philadelphia, preaching at soup kitchens where that you kind of have a captive audience where they have to sit for half an hour, 45 minutes before they get their soup and bread. Mm-hmm. I was there all the time, nonstop preaching the gospel down on the streets in Philadelphia, handing out tracts. A lot of that kind of work, and of course, preaching in youth group, and eventually in some churches. But it's like you look back at it and you think, "Gosh, I hope that some of those people saw through me, in a negative sense then, but a positive sense now. I hope they took what I said with a grain of salt. I hope." And I have gone back to some of the people that I knew would be open to hearing it and apologizing. And some of them have been very gracious. I know some of them wouldn't hear it because they'd just be like, "What are you talking about? Jesus is real and you need to get saved again." But I can definitely relate to that. And I just wanted to ask, like, how do you deal with that grief now? Like, do you feel like you're moving past it, or does it just overwhelm you at times?
Well, one of my core values is don't give in to shame,
Mm,
toxic shame. The difference in healthy guilt and shame and toxic guilt and shame is healthy guilt, healthy shame. You shouldn't do that. Stop. You stop, it goes away. Toxic shame, you're bad. You're bad to the, what you always do is bad. You're bad to the core and you will never change.
mm,
I say no to toxic guilt and shame.
yeah.
And this life is what we make of it. Christians challenge me online. You can't have any purpose. Well, just watch me. I do have a sense of purpose. Well, what is it? It's what I decide it to be. I value my family, my relationships, my friendships. I'm a communicator, just kind of, I don't know, genetic, I don't know. So I communicate. I have a, and one of the things, and I see this, you this way as well, Tim. Um, I want to be a voice of calmness and kindness in this raucous debate. Um, Now, if people push me too hard, I can, I can fire back, but I really always start, and I frequently respond on a tweet. I'll say, I respect your right to believe what you believe, and I believe you when when you tell me that that's how it feels. Because I mean, and I ask the same thing when I tell you this is how it feels to be a non-believer. That's the only way somebody can know how it feels to me, as long as I'm being honest, and I am about being honest about it. So, uh, but I think finding community, whether it's, and it's hard because the numbers are small and there aren't a bunch of secular communities like there are churches on every corner. But finding ways to talk and interact. I mean, I think our conversation today has probably been therapeutic for both of us because we're kind of we're on the same page, we're sharing openly and honestly, and that's healing.
Mm,
And I think that and I admire the courage of people. My my parents were both deceased, and either almost all or all of my deeply religious aunts and uncles were deceased because this happened so late in my life. I can't even imagine the flack and the difficulties I would have gotten had this happened earlier in my life. So I have a lot of respect for the courage of people who follow the truth where they know it's leading. And I find, and I mean, I still mess up. I mean, ask my wife. She can tell you, what's the latest thing I did that ticked her off. But um, I like the challenge of living life as a caring person who and one of the reasons I like photography, I don't worship a god anymore, but I experience wonder at this universe. I'm lucky to be alive. I'm lucky to be able to go out and see a lake or a bird that's beautiful that I can watch and photograph. And so embracing life now, here, this is life, as opposed to thinking that, well, this life's pretty horrible, but heaven will be great. No, I don't even want to think that anymore. I mean, well, it'd be nice if we were going to live forever, but I don't think I don't see any evidence of that. So let's
mm.
live now, let's embrace it. And when we're hurting, let's help each other, let's support each other, talk, listen. Um, I think that's the way.
I'm curious, since you mentioned eternity, if you could live forever, would you want to?
Uh, one of the I'm always moving, thinking, acting. I have attention deficit disorder, not the hyperactive part, but in my head, there's always a lot going on. And if I thought about, say, doing something illegal and going to prison and being locked up in a little cell and not having any books or anything, boy, that is frightening to me. Um, that may seem like a strange way to begin my answer to your question, but the answer is, well, it would depend on what we're going to be doing in eternity. And
Absolutely.
when I was a preacher, this is one of those things that kind of stuck with me. I decided to preach a sermon on heaven. I was going to preach on what is heaven like, and I started looking through the Bible, and it's like, well, streets of gold, was it walls of jasper, singing praises. What else you got? That's about it. So I pivoted and I preached on 1 Corinthians 13, the love chapter. Love is patient, love is kind, and so on, because I figure heaven's going to be where all the love is. So it's going to be a place where, kind, joy, all that stuff. But I was surprised myself how little the Bible really had to say. A year or two ago, I wrote an article on who's going to clean the bathrooms in heaven, because I started trying to think through this. Like, okay, well, Jesus ate food when he, according to the New Testament, after he was resurrected. So, will there be bathrooms in heaven, and who will clean them? And it just goes crazy if you start trying to follow it to any kind of. And I know the Christians have an answer. Well, we'll eat, but we won't have to poop. Okay, whatever you say. I don't know, but
It's amazing.
yeah,
With with looking at Christianity and some of the different questions that we could come up with and objections, one of the things that I think really strikes me is the bizarreness factor. And I wanted to ask just how you related to this as you were deconverting. But when you look at the story, for example, of Yahweh, and we get it preached so much to us, God's love is unconditional. You just come as you are. After 100 verses of that, come as you are. God loves you unconditionally. Once you're in his family, you're safe. You're who's going to take you out of his hands? He's got the strongest hands ever. You're so safe and secure. But when you actually look at the Old Testament and some of the New, you get a real clear message of if you're on God's side and obeying him and loving him appropriately, he will love you back and bless you. But if you don't, he will definitely curse you, to the point where he talks about, he will, destroy your land. He'll get you so poor that you'll eat your own children. He talks about, if you're so wicked to me, I'm going to lift up your skirt and show your nakedness to people. I mean, he's a weird, wicked, psycho God. But we loved him. Kind of that whole, what is it, the Stockholm syndrome. We loved our captor. When you look at that alone, but then you add in stuff like the Lord's table, where I know we weren't, into transubstantiation, but just the idea of like we were pretending symbolically every week or every month to eat somebody's flesh and drink their blood. And in
yeah.
terms of the
We
gospel,
sing a hymn. Nothing but what can wash away my sin? Nothing but the blood of Jesus. What can make me whole again? Nothing but the blood of Jesus. Oh, precious is the flow that makes me white as snow. I sang that for decades. It's weird. It's weird. Yeah.
does it ever strike you like, how did I not see it? And even just the real
Yes.
basic premise of the gospel, like God has to have blood to forgive, like just
Well,
the bare bones of Christianity. It's just so weird.
the very idea, God loves you unconditionally. Are you kidding me? No. If you don't believe in him and do it right, you're going to be punished forever. And I'll tell you one thing that I think about a lot. So as an evangelical Baptist, Scientologists, those people are nuts. How does anybody believe that? Mormons, are you kidding me? Special underwear? Really? Um, let's see, who else? We got Scientologists, Mormons. I was thinking of somebody else. Well, doesn't
J,
matter.
JWs or the Adventists.
Jehovah's Witnesses, a cult, David Koresh. What's wrong with these people? And now I look at my own previous belief as I looked at those groups. I think they're more extreme. I think that what I believed made more sense than what they believed. But I look at myself and what I used to believe in the same way. Because, and it's what makes you realize there is a a magic spell. It's not really magic, but it's like and where does it start? The indoctrination of children.
Hmm.
And one of the things I was really into the church growth movement back in the 80s, and I learned a lot from it. But I learned some surprising things. Like I learned that and many people today don't remember the Billy Graham Crusades. He was the most famous man in the world, not preacher, person. And he'd have these giant crusades in major cities across the world, and thousands of people would come forward. The first thing I learned was, and I was always amazed, because if you ever offer an invitation, it takes a minute or two for people to start coming. In his, just as soon as he said it, they started coming down from the balconies. Well, those were the counselors who were positioned all over the arena, and that was their plan. As soon as the music starts, you go down to the front, so everybody else is looking, saying, oh, wow, everybody's going. The other thing I learned was that of all those people who went to the front, maybe only about 15% or 20% were people who were committing their lives to Jesus for the first time. And I found that true in most churches. The only exception is a missionary movement like into South Korea or Africa or somewhere where there's a cultural change. But this whole story, I was lost and now I was found. Yeah, I was 9 years old. I was lost. I'd done some terrible things like, well, wait a minute. I'm not sure what I did that Jesus had to die on the cross for me, but I know I needed it. I know I was a sinner. So, I mean, it's largely children. And this may sound really strange, but as I look back over my life and my ministry, a lot of it was about wanting to be a good boy. And even as men, if we're taught, there's so many things we're taught. My dad, one day, my job was to clean the garage on Saturday. And I was out there, it was about 12, sweeping. I didn't want to be clean. And he says, let me show you how to sweep. He grabs that broom and man, he just, he's making it his life's work for about a minute. This is how you sweep the floor. I got it. And it's how I did my work and my ministry. And, don't give up, work hard. That was a core value that was taught to me as a child. So, yeah, it's crazy. I don't start with that. I hardly ever even say that. I don't even know. Part of me doesn't even really want to be heard saying that by believers, because that's not where you start by telling people. But as I look back on what I believed, I can't even make sense of it anymore. And that's surprising, confusing, sad to me. And one of my best friend still goes to the church, the last church where I served. We agree to disagree. But after I wrote Goodbye Jesus, one day he said, it sounds like you're saying I'm stupid, Tim. No, because I'm not stupid. And I believed it. So I'm not saying you're stupid. I'd have to say I was stupid if that's what I was doing. I'm not against Christians. I'm not even going to bring it up in day-to-day life unless they want to talk about it. I believe churches do a lot of good for a lot of people. But it's about what's true. And it doesn't make any sense to me anymore. When I stopped making, it's like you have an abusive parent and you've been taught to make excuses for them. I just watched I can't remember the exact name, but it's about the Bill Gothard scandal.
The shiny happy people.
Yeah, shiny happy people. Oh my gosh. And when I was at Wheaton College, there were people who'd say, you got to go to Gothard. You got to go. And I'd listen to it and it sounded good. But then it's like, oh, wait, he's not married and he's telling people how to be married and blah, blah, and all these things that I don't think so. I think also it was cost quite a bit. But I had no idea. So you watch those people and the damage that was done to their lives, and the repression of human sexuality, for example. What does it do? You end up having people, you know, abusing children, because it's like you're trying to press down something that is human and natural. And that I watching that, I found that really shocking. Um, so I don't, and I think it's bad for us as non-believers, humanists, atheists, agnostics, whatever we call ourselves. There's so many differences in churches. And if we start off by, I see people, hear people, atheists, who say, all religion is insanity. Well, I don't know if you can call it insanity if a whole culture is going that way. Maybe there's a better name for it.
Hmm.
Was it insanity when everybody thought the earth was flat? No, they just didn't know any better. So I
Yeah,
think as much as we can respect, and as much as we can say, disagreeing with you doesn't mean I hate you or dislike you. Let's talk about it.
yeah. I love your thoughts on that. I just want to add a couple quick thoughts if I could, just to piggyback. I I do think that you're hitting the nail on the head in talking about the idea that this is about kids in many ways. And I would use the phrase psychological child abuse for this, like when you tell a child, original sin messages, you were born a sinner, and God is seeing in your head and your heart and constantly judging you, and you're so bad that literally his son had to be tortured. That's how bad you are. And if it was only you that had ever been in the garden and only you that had sinned, he would have still had to do this for just you. You're that bad, even as a kid. Um, and I remember when I've told this story before, but right before I left Christianity, I was at a Presbyterian church here in Atlanta called Perimeter Church. And I remember the pastor talking about counseling a woman who had just lost a child who had been born. It wasn't a miscarriage, but his baby had been born, and then she lost it. And she was just going through grief. And he said he had to eventually tell her in his mind the truth. Ma'am, the truth is your baby deserved to die. And you look at these messages that we get as kids, and when you put that on children, like I understand the idea of let's live and let live. You believe what you believe, I believe what I believe. We can still go out and have a cup of coffee and be friends. But you get this messaging to children, and I begin to, in my mind, think there. I want to respect people's religion, but when you start saying my religion requires and demands that I brainwash children and hurt their little hearts right from day one, that's where I feel very compelled. And I feel like one of the, obviously you can't tell people what to do with how they raise their kids and so forth. But one of the things that I feel so compelled to focus on with my journey is to say, all right, what can I do? If you can't do much even though you feel so burdened about it, what can you do? This information that we talked about, comparative mythology and all these things that helped us to understand where this whole religion came from and evolved from, to begin to create resources for people to show them. So when kids read the story of Jesus walking on water, they can understand which Greek gods that came from, turning water into wine, crying tears of blood. We can tell which Greek gods these things came from. And to put it on in a video, which is one of my goals, and then a book eventually. But to put this out there, and obviously Christians aren't going to show it, but hopefully it'll spread at least to secular families. But to give people this sense of like, okay, if even if you want to teach your kids to be Christians or raise them to be Christians, at least tell them where it came from. At least give them the full story. I know a lot of people would never do that, but I just feel like we have to try. But I feel like it's important for us as a community to call it what it is. It is a version of psychological child abuse, and it breaks my heart. And especially, I remember Marlene Winnell, and I interviewed her a while ago. She was talking about the idea, like when you see, especially like in a Catholic church, you actually see the icons of the Jesus figure in his passion being crucified, and you see this the nails and the spear hole in his side, and literally children are thinking not just intellectually Jesus died from it, but that picture, that man's torture, is literally because I'm that bad. I don't know. I feel like there's a part of me that wants to say I got to draw the line somewhere, and when you start doing that to kids, I do have a problem. I don't quite go the route of saying, you just believe what you believe, I just believe what I believe. You're hurting children. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's a really tough issue. Um, I I would say that the numbers indicate that regardless of what you and I do, younger people are moving away from religious belief. Now they're not I'm not sure what they're replacing it with, or you could have an argument on do they need to replace it with anything? Maybe they don't. I have some concern that the sociological needs met by churches, place of community, a place of support in times of loss or struggle. Um, I mean, these things have a way of working themselves out in terms of somebody does something that meets a need and then that grows. But one of my concerns is that we in the secular community could do more to provide those kinds of alternative places to meet. It's harder to do. It's easier to motivate people when behind all the motivation is the idea that God is watching and you're going to receive an eternal reward. Everybody's getting to heaven by faith, but the size of your mansion is determined by your works, that sort of thing. And it's more like herding cats because you've got a group of independent thinkers. But I know like the community that I participate in here in Houston, the friendships that I have there, the best time is we go to lunch afterwards and we talk like things about things like you and I've talked about today, and that helps us. So I hope that we can see more of that, and I want to do whatever I can to encourage that, which would be very small, but that's a concern I have. I believe the propensity, the being everywhere nature of information today. There's a lot of bad things about the internet, but there's a lot of good things. And one of the good things is there's so much information. And I think perhaps what is happening to a lot of younger people is that they're going online and they're reading things that raise questions that nobody in their home or their church is willing to talk about. So, but the issue, I resonate with what you're saying about children when it's up close, and you're torn between respecting the right of a parent to make their own decisions about parenting, but also you're watching something done that in another culture might not even be, I mean, it would be regarded as abusive. Uh, and when you think about it, what could a person or a teacher tell a child that is as threatening and as dark as you caused that man on that cross to have to die, and it not be regarded as a terrible thing to say? So religion gets a pass. You know, it's different. It's been around a long time. Over 2 billion people believe it. So just shut up. That's kind of the response. But
Yeah, I agree.
that's where it comes back to our, for me, a sense of mission of telling the truth and maybe making some small difference.
Yeah, absolutely. I like the phrase "leaving it better than you found it" for in terms of the
Yeah.
culture and the planet. Well, I know I've kept you for a while. I did want to maybe wrap up by a question I ask a lot toward the end. For anyone that's just at the beginning of the harder parts of this journey that we talked about, maybe it's they're just investigating, but they definitely know that they've seen some things that they can't unsee, or maybe they've gone far enough down the rabbit hole that they understand that they can't go back at all, that this is definitely um, there's some ways in which they might like their community or the cultural Christianity that they're in, but at the end of the day, they just can't believe this stuff anymore. They can see it's mythology, or whether they're actually already all the way out and they're just, thinking about, if I tell people, it's really going to be bad really quick. What would you advise to people in that spectrum where they're either fully out or they're starting that journey, and especially for the people where it's just they're just going through, like we talked about earlier, this the angst of it all. This is really a painful journey
Yeah,
just to
I
get
think for the
started.
people who are still in faith but are struggling, I would say if your faith is true, if it's what it says it is, it can stand any test. And it shouldn't need people to defend it by saying things to you like, don't talk to the people who left. That's what cults say. Don't
Mm.
go there. Don't ask that question. If faith is what it claims to be, it can stand any test. For people who are, I like the way you said it. It's the idea of your Humpty Dumpty and you fell off the wall and nobody can put you together again. The old you can't unsee something. You're Dorothy and you saw the wizard, the man behind the curtain, and you can't unsee it. You can't unknow it. I don't have any easy answer for that. It takes courage. And so, where do we find strength if we're not looking to heaven for that strength? One of the things I suggest in my book, How to Live a Meaningful Life, is remember the times in your life when you faced things that were really hard and somehow you did it. You didn't give up, you didn't quit, you made it through. Remember those times and acknowledge that you were strong. Maybe you've been told all your life that you're weak and only God did this or God did that. I would say recognize your own strength. Remember the times when you were strong. And then, knowing that that's who you are, embrace that strength now. Reach out, watch shows like yours and others on YouTube, on the internet that talk about these things and offer. What we're looking for is kindred minds, others who know what we have experienced and understand it. I wish I had an easy answer. It's probably going to be hard, but you're not alone. You're not the only one who's gone through it. And it looks like you're moving in the direction of history. We are outgrowing the training wheels of religion. Christopher Hitchens used to say religion is, how did he say it? Early man, the earliest, worst explanation of how things work and why things are the way they are. That's not an exact quote, but yeah, it was like they're trying to make sense of things. They didn't know germs existed. They didn't know so much. They thought the earth was flat, heaven is up. It's moving away from that. And so if you can no longer believe those things, you're part of the flow of history, it would appear at this point.
Mm. Well said. I love that you brought up the word courage a few times. That's such a good reminder because I think so many of us have this backdrop sense of you don't question God. You don't go there. You might have some questions, but you don't go the whole, even the Gideon with the fleece, you don't question him, you don't test him. That's what people who are defiant and disobedient do. You say to God, God, I've got some serious questions, but I will bow my knee and I will keep it bowed, or like Job at the end of his story, I will put my hand over my mouth. You are the creator God.
And
And
that's one of those crazy things. That's crazy. The God who created the universe can't defend himself, can't stand it if you ask a question.
yep,
That's crazy thought. And that's
it is.
cult behavior. Don't question Koresh. Don't question Jim Jones. They are God's people, God's spokespersons. Don't question Bill Gothard. It doesn't matter. It's all the same thing. So, yeah. Yep.
Yeah. And I think that one proverb that we all got drilled into our heads of um, don't lean on your own don't lean on your own understanding. The idea of you actually do at some point need to cross over a certain boundary and say, I'm gonna trust myself. I'm gonna trust my gut here.
Right.
Something's wrong. There's a splinter in my mind. I have to figure out why this doesn't make sense anymore. And it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone's gonna escape. But I remember when I was early on in my, and I'll keep this short. Remember when I was early on in my deconstruction process, I did not expect to deconvert. Even if at that point, if someone had said, "Be careful, you'll be an atheist," I would have laughed it off and said, "Atheism is just not an option." Period. But I remember saying to myself and to loved ones verbally, "Something's happening. I'm investigating some things in a way that I've never investigated before, and I need to just put this out there. I am more committed to the truth than to my current worldview. I hope they align, and that if I investigate the truth, it will just reconfirm my worldview. But if they don't, I'm going to go where the truth takes me." And that was more prophetic than I could have imagined. But that the bravery for people to say that, and some of us, especially when you grow up in certain ultra conservative fundamentalist groups, just the repression and the sense of like you can't go that way, or if you do, you are literally opening the door up to Satan and his demons. or you're being so arrogant, like your pride, you're doing what Satan did at his fall. He wanted to be on God's throne, and that's why this whole debacle started. You're doing the worst thing you could possibly do to put yourself above God. And for the bravery to say, at least emotionally, to say for the first time in your life, I'm going to put myself above this Yahweh character. I'm going to be willing to judge him. And for example, like when he says, go commit genocide, go steal people's land, go take slaves, child brides are fine, beat your slaves, all that stuff. You can stone people for not being virgins. For the first time in your life, like give yourself the freedom to say, I judge that stuff and it's not good. It's not. And I don't want it in my life anymore. And it's so, if you're not used to it, it's like, it's Twilight Zoney stuff. But once you get used to it, you're like, okay, this felt, looking back on it retrospectively, this was a lot healthier of a choice than I could have ever imagined. Yep. And it's hard, but I think courage and bravery, it's a good way to put it. It takes guts to do it, but it is a choice you have to make, and it will, as the Bible says, the truth will set you free.
And there is one other thing I'd say is deconversion is something you do, but it's also something that happens to you. And there is a point, there is a sense in which you're not totally in control of it, because it's about reality. And it's kind of like you just described, where reality takes over.
Yeah. It's very, very well said. Yeah, it's in some ways it feels like, I think one of my other interviewees a while ago said, deconversion is not something I chose. It happened to me. I couldn't not, like, this was the logical outcome of what I learned. Mm-hmm. And yeah, you can't go back. I love the Matrix movie. I know I've overused that metaphor, but you can't get plugged back in the Matrix even if you want to. So, well, yeah. This has been great to get to know you. I feel like I've got another million questions. So maybe at some point on the line, when you keep publishing books, maybe for sure if you have another book, but even just at some point we could do another topical discussion. I'd love to pick your brains some more, and especially to hear how it's going. But thank you so much. This has been great to get to hear your story.
Well, I've enjoyed it. It's been a good conversation. Thanks for inviting me, Tim.
Absolutely. Well, I'll just wrap up then by saying we've been speaking with Tim Sledge. Again, please go to the links beneath our video. Go check out his books, buy them, support him. Tim, thank you so much. Really appreciate your voice in our community. Thanks again.
Thank you.
All right.